Hello BookTube, and welcome to yet another weekly reading vlog. In this week I've managed to make progress on 3 books. The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood by Howard Pyle. The Courts of Chaos, part of the Chronicles of Amber series by Roger Zelazny. And The Linguistic Wars by Randy Allen Harris. So I'll start with the Courts of Chaos because this is the book that I have the least amount to say about. I am so close to the end, not just the Courts of Chaos, but the whole Chronicles of Amber series. At least the Corwin cycle of it, which is the volume I have here. Of course, I'm such a slow reader and I've got so many other distractions going on in my life. It's difficult to make any promises, but I suspect I'm going to finish this within the next week. Yeah, I really don't know if there's that much I can intelligently comment on the plot here. I mean, there were some very interesting settings. The Corwin, the main character, has been to like a land where there's a bunch of leprechauns. He's been to this really strange empty land where there is this giant stuck in a bog full of water, and the giant doesn't want to try and get out of the bog because he just wants to end it all. And then there's a bird of ill omen that's been waiting for Corwin there since the beginning of time, and a magic tree, and Corwin cuts a branch off the tree not realizing it's magic. There's a couple fights with the antagonist of the series, Brand, and then there's a big battle at the end that Corwin shows up at. There's some dark humor going on in here, there was a warrior that really wanted to fight Corwin, somebody who had been alluded to, I believe, in the previous books as a famous fencing instructor. And Corwin doesn't want to fight him, so he tries to run away, and then he ends up just stabbing the guy with a trick. And the guy says, "Oh, base. I expected better of thee." And Corwin says, "Well, this isn't exactly the Olympics. In other words, I'm just doing whatever I need to do to survive, and I don't care about following the rules of fair play." I mean, there's a lot in these few pages, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. There's also a lot of weird stuff. I mean, I guess that everything I described is probably sounding pretty weird. You know, the standard descriptions about traveling through strange lands that you have in these books. Now that the antagonist looks like he's been killed, and there's a few shocking plot reveals along the lines of, "Oh, I thought you were dead all along, but here you are alive after all," type twists. I'm not quite sure what's going to be left for the rest of the book to finish up. There is, of course, an existential dread, meaning the universe is in the process of being wiped out. But I really hope the resolution for that doesn't get dragged on too long, because I find those existential universe-ending plot lines to be a bit boring. But there's only 20 pages left. So we'll see how I'm doing next week on that. But that's all for now. Moving on then to The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a sore throat this week. Hopefully that won't slow me down too much. New Adventures of Robin Hood. Again, this is a 1883 book. Not this copy, obviously, but it was originally published in 1883. And it is apparently the first book to make a book out of the Robin Hood stories. Before then, they had just been a bunch of ballads. and then this guy was taking the ballads and weaving them into a coherent story. And as such, it's interesting to see maybe where these stories are, or where these characters are, closer to their origins. And this is a great example of it here, the chapter I read for this week, which is Guy of Gisborne. Now, if you're familiar with Robin Hood, you probably are familiar with the name of Guy of Gisborne because he pops up in a lot of the incarnations. For example, in that Kevin Costner movie, he played the cousin of the Sheriff of Nottingham. In the Errol Flynn movie, Guy of Gisborne was the main antagonist. He was the main guy that Robin Hood was fighting throughout that movie. According to Wikipedia, he frequently shows up as a rival with Robin Hood for the Maid Marian in a lot of the incarnations. But I was surprised he showed up in this incarnation. He's an outlaw, like Robin Hood, which is different than the incarnations I've been familiar with. Because, you know, like in that Errol Flynn movie, he's like a nobility. And in the Kevin Costner movie, he's, you know, related to the sheriff. But in this story, he shows up as an outlaw. So, like I said, generally speaking, the stuff in this book is closer to the old ballads. But that's not guaranteed. Because Howard Pyle, the author, did make up some stuff. And he did rearrange some stuff in some of the ballads. And he did smooth things over. So I went to Wikipedia and looked up Guy of Gisborne, which somehow I've made it through all my life so far without ever looking Guy of Gisborne up on Wikipedia, which is strange because I'm usually fascinated by these little side characters or minor characters in old legends like this. But yeah, Wikipedia says this is his origin. He, in the earliest ballads, he was an outlaw who the Sheriff of Nottingham hired to kill Robin Hood like a mercenary. And he was supposedly like a really ruthless, lethal outlaw, somebody who killed a lot of other people. And in this book, Robin Hood realizes that Guy of Gisborne is like a really bad guy. And that if he leaves him alive, Guy of Gisborne is going to go off to kill more people. So Robin Hood sets off to kill Guy of Gisborne in the duel he fights with him. Which is notable because, at least in this book, The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood by Howard Pyle, he's trying to soften Robin Hood's image from the ballads. So there was one other person Robin Hood killed that was right at the beginning, when he killed one of the king's men when he first became an outlaw. But then since then, he hasn't killed anyone in the whole book up until now, which apparently is different than the ballads. In the ballads, there's a heavier body count. But then here he does kill Guy of Gisborne. So yeah, I just thought it was interesting that, you know, the Guy of Gisborne that I thought I knew as a aristocrat or somebody who had at least some sort of familiar connections to the aristocracy was actually in the original stories just another ruthless outlaw. Sorry, just another outlaw, and one of a particularly ruthless variety. Okay, moving on. So, the Linguistic Wars, which I actually spent a great deal of time reading this week. I went all the way from page 16 to page 84, which doesn't sound like much, admittedly. But here again, we get back to something I've talked about before on these weekly reading vlogs, is that the amount of pages read during a week is really a very poor indicator, because these were heavy-duty pages. I mean, these were pages that required me to read them very slowly and pay close attention. Not to mention smaller print, etc., than the other books. Not to mention, excuse me, This is one of those books that has endnotes in the back. So you're constantly flipping to the back to read endnotes, and you know, I read this many pages of endnotes as well. So that's another reason that page count numbers aren't always a reliable indicator of how much reading you've been doing during a week, because it doesn't take into account flipping to the back to read the endnotes. Excuse me. Sounding a little hoarse. This is one of those things, just my luck. I was feeling fine all day till I sat down to make this video, and then all of a sudden get the hoarse voice. We will soldier on though. So in those pages there is a lot of information here, and I mentioned I had to read these carefully, and I did. It's a somewhat academic book. Maybe the best way of describing it is an academic book, but it's an academic book for the non-specialist, meaning you'd have to be somewhat academically inclined to want to tackle a book like this. But you don't have to be a specialist in linguistics. And in fact, it's deliberately aimed at people who aren't specialists in linguistics. The guy who wrote it seems to really know his stuff, but he is, according to his author's bio, which was somewhere over here, he is a professor of English, not linguistics. So I'm sure maybe that helps him translate this into something that's palatable for the non-specialist. And then again, to compare it to the book I was previously reading, no comparison. This book completely did my head in, gave me a huge headache. This book I can follow. I've got to read it carefully, but I can follow it. So where I left off last week, it was on their history of linguistics, and they were just getting to Ferdinand de Saussure. And then they're continuing on their history of linguistics, and they get to Sapir, and especially Bloomfield. Now, Sapir is Edward Sapir, whose name I was vaguely familiar with before reading this book, mainly because of linguistic relativism, I believe as it's known, or the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which shares its name with another linguist, Whorf. What was Whorf's first name? Benjamin Whorf, I want to say. But yeah, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. It's probably not Benjamin Whorf. Otherwise known as linguistic relativism, is the idea that the language you speak influences the way you think. So if you speak English, your view of the world is going to be different than if you speak Japanese, because the way the language encodes thought has an impact on your mind. Now, that's not actually in this book, or it's in this book briefly in a footnote, I think, which is all Whorf gets here with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. But other than that, I hadn't known about Sapir at all, and it talks about him in connection with Bloomfield as the two guys who really started linguistics in North America. Well, actually, there's a running joke that the author has all throughout this history of linguistics that he goes through, which is that linguistics is always becoming a science. So the idea is that, you know, linguistics could be part of the humanities, arts, literature, history, because it obviously has to do with language, which is usually the purview of the humanities. And at various times in its history, it sounds like it has been housed in the humanities departments, like it has been in philosophy or English departments. But the people who are interested in linguistics are always trying to make it a science, and the idea being you have this data, the data being the language that we all speak, and you can treat that data just like any other natural object. You can poke at it, you can probe at it, you can make hypotheses and test them against the data. I'm using some of the same I'm using some of the same imagery, by the way, that Randy Allen Harris does in my summary, just to be clear where I'm stealing that from. You could make the case for it being treated like a science, the way science examines any natural object. But what's interesting about this history of linguistics that he goes through is that each generation of linguists tend to view the methodology of the previous linguists with disdain, and say, no, you guys aren't scientists, we're the scientists. Your methodology was flawed. Your assumptions were flawed, but now we are going to make linguistics a science. At one point, he has a joke in here. Here it is. He says, just as the middle class is always rising, linguistics is always becoming a science. Like every generation, they say, okay, now linguistics is a science. But yes, in the North American school, Sapir and Bloomfield were the ones responsible for finally making linguistics a science. And again, that's a running joke that everybody is finally making linguistics a science. Sapir gets a rather brief coverage here. I mean, everything's brief because this is a real lightning quick history of linguistics. But then the real focus is on Bloomfield. And Bloomfield's idea was, well, yeah, he talks about a couple of things, actually. He says one of the things that sets linguistics in North America apart from the linguistic scholars or linguistic philosophers in Europe was in America they had what he calls the Amerindian imperative, which was the belief that the linguists had at the time that it was their duty to go out and catalog all the Indian in the sense of Native American, and I know that's not the preferred term nowadays, but that is the term that's used here mostly. Go off and categorize all the Amerindian languages. And it doesn't say explicitly, but you definitely get the sense that there's a concern among the linguists that these languages are dying out. And so it is the duty of the linguists to go out and catalog and categorize and record as much of the Amerindian language as you can before they die out. Now, if you're like me and you think, oh no, Indian languages, I can't, I'm not going to be able to get my head around the grammar of that. You don't need to worry. They don't go into any technicalities at all. They just talk about it in generalities. And one of the generalities they mention is in Europe, they were really interested in historical linguistics. So, tracking how the English language has changed over time and where the English language came from and the Indo-European language families and stuff like that. But he says one of the consequences of concentrating on the Amerindian languages in America is that they weren't concerned with historical linguistics because there weren't written records to go through, by and large. There was only the language as it existed at this point in time. So that's, he says, one of the reasons why linguists in North America were not concerned with the same things that the Europeans were concerned with. North America here, by the way, appears to mean Canada as well. Sapir was actually, where was Sapir in? Somewhere in Canada. Was it Ottawa? And I forget where Bloomfield was. Was Bloomfield also in Canada? But I don't remember. But it was, yeah, it's North American, meaning Canada and America. But the other thing, and again, this is Bloomfield, Bloomfield wanted to make linguistics a science by taking the language and not trying to impose a grammar on it, as the the old Europeans had done in the old centuries, but just describe it completely. And he also believed in breaking it down into the smallest parts. So first you start with just the sound system. What are the sounds of the system? What are the sounds of the language? And linguists refer to this as phonetics. And then you wait to see how those, try and figure out how those sounds are categorized. And linguists refer to this as phonemics. And this is a little bit of a tricky distinction. And in fact, I hope I'm remembering this right. But the difference between phonetics and phonemics are just purely the sounds. So you take the sound that a speaker says, you can put it on a spectrogram and analyze the F3 frequency and the F2 frequency and the F1 frequency and see what the wavelengths are doing, etc. But that doesn't always tell you exactly what the letters of the alphabet are. For example, in English, the P sound has some different pronunciations depending on where it is in the word, what letters go with it, and for example, there's like a P as in stop, which is stop, and then there's a P as in pit, where, sorry, I'm screwing up this example by, I think I'm not pronouncing the words right because I'm thinking too much about my pronunciation. But a P at the beginning of the word will have what they call an aspirated, where a bunch of air is released, like in pit, unless it's in a consonant cluster like spit. And then there's not a breath of air released. You can try this with your hand in front of your face, like pit, spit, something like that, or stop at the end of the words. No, actually stop. I felt a breath of air there. Okay, I'm completely screwing up this example, the particulars of this example, but I'm fairly sure that in the generalities stand, which means that P is pronounced differently in different words. And it could have been, like in a different language or in a different universe, that these different sounds would correspond to different letters. But that's not the way an English speaker hears it. An English speaker would always hear it as P. And so that would be the phoneme, would be the P, which is different from the pure sound that you hear. So the Bloomfield wanted to start with phonetics. So first you describe the sounds, then you try and classify the phonetic sounds into phonemes, and then you can build from the phonemes into words, and then you can build from words into grammar, and then you just start at the very bottom and you build it all the way up. But grammar was, in Bloomfield's view, a long way off. And a little bit more nebulous, which he felt a little bit uncomfortable with. He wanted to start with what you as a descriptive scientist could be very confident about, which was just the sounds and the phonemes and building up into the words. Bloomfield also didn't want to get messed around talking about the meaning of language, even though he acknowledged that meaning was connected with language. He wanted to put meaning off onto somebody else's field. Like he said, okay, the philosophers or the psychologist or the psychiatrists can deal with meaning. But meaning is a little bit nebulous for linguistics to get into. Linguistics is just talking about sounds and words and the rules that govern the words. And so this was what he built his program on. And apparently he had a book which laid out exactly how you could do that program. And it says in the book somewhere, it says, this worked perfectly. You know, the linguists went out, they cataloged the languages, they recorded all these American Indian languages, and they were doing good work, and it was working as a system. But he says the problem with the system is that all of the good stuff was now off limits. And the good stuff meaning the meaning of words and the meaning of sentences and how we convey meaning with our language, and the more complex sentence transformations. And then this is where he gets into Chomsky. Now, I actually did not realize this before reading this book, but Chomsky's made a few different waves on the scene, and his first wave was a book called, what was it called? Syntactic Structures, I believe, which was big at the time because it was trying to make a breakthrough into using a Bloomfield methodology into tackling grammar and also sentence transformations, like the way a sentence transforms when you change it from an active to a passive, or from a positive to a negative, or from a statement to an interrogative. It was very well received, but people at the time didn't realize that a revolution in linguistics was underway. But then Chomsky got more into transformation of language, and at the same time started to attack behaviorist explanations of language, which is Bloomfield at the time, Bloomfield back in his day, which sounds like it was about 10 or 20 years before Chomsky, had said that in terms of the relationship between meaning and language, we'll leave that to the psychologists. And when he said psychologists, he was thinking behaviorists, because that was the major theory in psychology at the time. But Chomsky hit out at the behaviorists with his famous critique of Skinner. And this Chomsky's critique of Skinner was something I had known about before. And I suspect if you know anything about Chomsky's linguistic theories, you know about his critique of Skinner. But if you don't, or if you maybe you don't know about Chomsky, or you know about his politics but you don't know about his language, then his review of Skinner's verbal behavior is worth Googling. It's a classic in the field. It's very readable in a sense, because even if you can't follow the technical argument, and I couldn't follow all of the technical argument, you can still see that Chomsky is going out for blood. I mean, it's just a classic Chomsky polemic. And I've read it before. You can find it on the web. It's usually linked to off of Chomsky websites, which include collections of his writings. And it's quite readable, just for the general tone of it, even if you can't follow all the technical arguments. So Skinner had previously argued that language was acquired through behavioralism, which is the whole idea of stimulus and response. So, for example, a child is experimenting with language. They say ice cream, and then their dad says, "Oh, you want an ice cream?" and gives them an ice cream, and the child gets an ice cream, and then that's how that association between the word and the meaning are reinforced through classic, the behaviorism, like the rat pressing the lever and getting the treat type things, which sounds ridiculous in retrospect, especially once you get to the complex grammar. But apparently that's the theory that was in vogue, or I don't know. I mean, I've somewhat suspected there's a bit of a straw man going on with Skinner, or other people have suggested that. But that's the theory that Chomsky famously took down, which is covered on pages 55 to 59 of this book. And I am out of time. Sorry, this camera shuts off after